Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. And it's time to see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Ian Dunt and the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, Camilla Turner. Very good evening to you both. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. Well, now, according to the Financial Times, the war in Ukraine could be about to enter a new phase, it says, as Moscow looks at using aircraft and helicopters. The front of the Daily Express says that British Army troops insist that they can stand up to President Vladimir Putin if Russia attacks a NATO ally. The Metro reports that Cheshire police are investigating whether the murder of 16-year-old Brianna Jai was a hate crime as she was transgender. The Sun carries a photograph of what it says is evidence in the case of the missing mother of two, Nicola Bulley. The Eye says there's a postcode lottery when it comes to the supply of hormone replacement therapy drugs, with women in poorer areas far less likely to be able to get hold of them. And the Star offers a light-hearted take on remarks from a former senior RAF officer who has insisted that the objects such as the recent Chinese spy balloons should not be shot down until officials can be sure what is inside them. And just a reminder that by scanning the QR code on the screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And as I say, we're joined tonight by Ian Dunt and Camilla Turner, of course. So let's, very good evening to you again. Let's dive straight in then. And I want to start with the Financial Times. Quite a few interesting stories on the front of that. And we'll pick out this one concerning these public sector wage disputes, which have been going on and on, it seems. And the FT asking, will Sunak backdate key workers' pay, which would be a way, I suppose, of increasing the current pay offer. Camilla, do you think that might be a solution?
Yes, this is quite an interesting suggestion the Financial Times are talking about, saying this is something under discussion, essentially making the pay award for the year ahead, which will start in April, but then backdating it to the start of the year as a way to try and see off these strikes once and for all. Because, of course, the government's been in a complete deadlock with unions lasting the past few months, meaning we've had rolling public sector strikes, and there's no end point in sight at the moment, with the different unions asking for inflation-busting pay rises, the government trying to hold firm, and they have essentially managed to sort of stand their ground and wait it out. So we're now nearing April, so the conversation will now be all moving towards next year's pay awards, whereas the unions were trying to talk about last year's pay awards. But really, for the government, it's not a good look to have these strikes going on. They're going to need to find a solution at some point, and this could be a potential way to break the deadlock.
Of course, we've got a budget coming up, and we know the views of the Treasury on how much money is available. I mean, Ian, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, suggested this about a month ago or so, didn't he? And it didn't seem to catch on then.
Yeah, that's right. It was about 10th of January. There were briefings to the press, I think to the Independent and to the Guardian at the time, sort of stating that this is a way that we can do it. The union reaction was quite interesting. And it was basically to say, well, look, if it's a small pay rise, the fact that he's backdated it won't make any difference. If it's a larger pay rise, the fact that he's backdated it might make some difference. And you get the impression that Barclay thought it might make some kind of difference, which raises the question as to, well, we've gone through another month of this stuff without any movement on this and still basically being presented with stories that are exactly the same as the ones that we were looking at a month ago. And that speaks to the bigger problem the government has, which is that it has now presided over this, going on for month after month after month. Now, if it ends now, at any moment that they come up with a solution for it, the question is going to be, why on earth did you just come up with this earlier and save us all an awful lot of bother? And that eventually, ultimately, whichever way this goes, is how it's going to play out.
And also thinking it through, Camilla, is it also a way of trying to shore up the union's confidence in these pay review bodies? Because we've also been hearing over the last few months, haven't we, that well, we don't trust them, we don't believe them. It's you, the government, that pulls the strings. So let's talk direct to you.
Yes, I think that's right. There's been a huge row going on about these pay review bodies, with the government trying to say, oh, well, it's not up to us, it's up to these independent pay review bodies, and all we can do is put in our evidence and see what they say. And then you've had a situation where unions are saying, well, we don't really have confidence in these processes, we're just going to boycott them and pull out of it altogether. So the things are sort of really deteriorating, and I think some kind of breakthrough that restores confidence in these pay review bodies, and also ideally leads to a breakthrough in the discussions and gets the strikes called off, is really at this stage something the government is probably looking to do, having tried to stand their ground and wait it out and see if the strikes go away. Clearly that's not happening, and there is still, at least some public support, particularly for NHS workers on strike. A lot of people feeling the pinch with the cost of living and thinking, well, would it be the worst thing to give these people a pay rise?
Yeah, quite a lot of this dovetails or has relevance to some of those labour market numbers we got out today. I want to bring in the Metro, which, as I say, is related. Number of days lost to strikes, the highest since 1989. So, Ian, we haven't quite reached 1970s levels yet. Many parallels, though, of course.
Yeah, there are. I mean, it's easy to take those parallels too far, right? So, I mean, when you had the deflationary sort of crisis in the 70s, yes, you had militant trade unions, far more militant than what we're seeing today. You also had, I mean, really OPEC and the oil crisis. I mean, when the price of oil spikes, the price of everything just goes up with it, because it is the mechanism by which you get products from one place to another. And of course, you had the kind of failure of the Keynesian system that we've been using up until then. It was a sort of confluence of factors. Oil was the most important. And I think that kind of muscle memory in the government and in the Treasury in particular is part of the reason they've been so stubborn over this issue now. Just thinking like, well, look, if we start unleashing pay rises, we start stimulating demand, we get inflation going even higher. But the situation's are broadly similar, but they're not exactly comparable. And probably a bit more of that should have been taken into account a little bit earlier in this process.
Yeah, as I say, it's 1989 we've reached at the moment. And Camilla, I mean, what's your assessment of, you touched on it there, of how much damage it's all doing to the government, just also on the Metro there, as lots of students and indeed their parents and carers know. 70,000 university staff now joined the rally. They've been taking action for some time now. How damaging is it for the government that, it just seems to feed into the broken Britain narrative?
Absolutely. The longer these strikes continue, the worse a look it is for a government. If you've got a situation where people can't get a doctor's appointment, they worry about what's going to happen if their elderly relative falls over. Will they get the care they need? Will the ambulance show up? People sort of getting used to just not being able to rely on trains coming on time, schools having to close, university lecturers, the post not working. Almost every aspect of our public services are just quite far below par at the moment, and that's not something that really goes down well for voters. It's one of the factors that Tory MPs cite as one of the reasons why the Conservatives are really trailing in the polls at the moment. So this is quite important for the government to sort this out, particularly as we're coming into the local elections, which is the first sort of actual electoral test for Rishi Sunak. It's one thing to be trailing in the polls, but does that translate into the way people actually vote? So I think there is now some urgency among government ministers to really try and sort out these strikes, just because it's then one less thing for people to hold against them.
I want to get on now to the situation in Ukraine, and much to discuss surrounding that. But this on the front of the Daily Express is interesting, Ian. It's a riposte from senior defence chiefs, as the Express terms them, to this reports that came from Germany, weren't they, that NATO did not want Britain to assume control to provide the high readiness force. That's 5,000 troops that would lead any response should Russia, for instance, attack a NATO ally. They apparently, according to German media, claimed that NATO had asked Germany to continue playing that role. This riposte saying, well, the British Army is ready and capable.
Yeah, I mean, which it is. I mean, first of all, this is not going to happen. I mean, Russia has, I know it's dangerous to make predictions when it comes to basically a lunatic like Putin, but nevertheless, Russia has its hands full and can't really seem to make any sustained progress in Ukraine as it is, the chances of it opening up another front against another country and having to trigger a NATO response are very, very unlikely indeed. If it did happen, I mean, one of the things that Britain has retained in its capabilities and its status is the ability for military action. And it would be able to stand up, especially in alliance with some of the most powerful countries on earth. So this bit doesn't seem really to stack up. And it's again that sort of presentation of just this sort of quiver that we've had over the winter in the Western alliance against Russia that you saw, I think, with the sort of tanks debate over the last couple of months, of just some slight fracture, some slight acrimony in the Western response that, frankly, at the moment just isn't particularly helpful.
What do you make of it, Camilla? Britain is ready to lead that high readiness force, but also, as we take in the Financial Times, well, Russia masses aircraft within striking range of Ukraine targets, the West warns. Well, one would have imagined that they've already been doing that, but they've got even more aircraft, helicopters, fighter jets throwing into the water to support its stuttering land offensive. This all then leads into, does it not, whether the West will supply its fighter jets to the Ukrainians?
Yes, that's right. And of course, this was President Zelensky's big plea to the West when he did his whistle-stop tour of London and other European locations last week. He was really calling out on Western allies to say, please provide Ukraine with fighter jets. And this Financial Times story is really just showing how much Russia's ramping up for this latest offensive that has been talked about for weeks, and is, sort of, as the article says, the next phase of the war. So we can see, on the one hand, you've got Russia ramping up its response, and on the other hand, Western allies still really just questioning over what their response is going to be. The article talks about the rapid need for anti-aircraft defense capabilities, but as well as that, of course, you've got Zelensky's calls for greater fighter jets from the West. This, at the moment, is something Western countries are hesitating on, and there are also questions around the capabilities of the West. How many of these do they have? How quickly can they get over to Ukraine? So all sorts of questions there, and really running out of time probably before Ukraine needs to have answers on these questions.
OK, we're going to take a short break now. You are, of course, staying with us. Coming up, as Sarah Everard's killer admits additional crimes, we'll be discussing what more police forces can do to try to improve their safeguarding procedures. You're watching the press preview. With me now are Ian Dunt and Camilla Turner. Well, let's have a look at this. I mean, it's just so disturbing. It's inside the Metro. Police officers face misconduct claims on Cousins' probes. Now, this comes after he admitted 3 counts of indecent exposure, one of which took place, much reported, in a McDonald's restaurant 4 days before he abducted, raped and killed Sarah Everard. And that, of course, is going to be subject. We know, Ian, that there's an independent inquiry taking place into whether opportunities were missed.
Yeah, and I mean, it's, you don't want to preempt it, but it's really very difficult to see how the answer to that could be no, given what we're reading right now. I mean, there is now an investigation into gross misconduct of at least one officer in the Met, into misconduct for an officer in the Kent police, about the manner in which those incidents were investigated, being non-professional in the manner in which they approached and failing to follow them up. And I mean, that can possibly be because we treat flashing as this kind of grubby form of antisocial behavior, the joke, that we knew from the 70s and the 80s, instead of the start of a process by which someone commits very, very serious sexual and violent offences. And it could be, and almost certainly is, because the police are, especially the Met, completely unable to deal with this kind of incident because it has that culture within it, because of the macho culture within the Met that would naturally not take these kind of incidents seriously. So we'll need to see more details. But at the moment, I mean, it's very hard to look at this in anything like approaching a reasonable mind and to think that nothing could have been done to stop it from happening, because by virtue of what we're reading, it clearly could have been.
Yeah, I mean, and indeed, as you say, not to preempt the inquiry, but, you know, some of the main questions being, given just how alert the restaurant staff were, they had the number, they had the CCTV, the fact that he was a police officer was apparently not discovered.
Yeah, I mean, in at least one of the incidents, that was not discovered. And the others, we have this, I mean, it's quite vague, the stuff that's being described at the moment of this sort of unprofessional behaviour, particularly from the Met officer in question, which again, we can only come to our own conclusions as to the kind of thing that might entail at the moment. But we can sort of imagine what they might be. So we'll be following the details with interest. But at the moment, you know, it does seem to be stacking up a narrative that we now know very, very well indeed about a vision of the Met that just needs proper root and branch reform if it is to maintain the confidence of women.
And just a quick thought on that, Camilla. I also want to put to you a story in the eye. But yeah, the clear, just standout questions that need to be answered about how thoroughly the police investigated Wayne Couzens before he carried out that appalling crime.
Yes, I think that's right. And the problem for the Met Police is that this goes far deeper, clearly, than just Wayne Couzens. It's, you know, the horrific crimes that he perpetrated and you know, the amount that did for the public and women to sort of really lose their trust in the police just because it was so shocking. But also all these missed opportunities and all these red flags that might have been raised over time had they been looked into properly, or had the systems been joined up enough to spot the warning signs. And this McDonald's indecent exposure incident coming just a few days before the Sarah Everard murder is really the most shocking. And I think what all these examples are showing is just how deep the reform of the Met needs to be, not just of their sort of personnel, but also the checks and balances, their systems, the way they record crimes and the way they look into things. Because clearly, if quite major red flags are being missed along the way, and then people are going on to commit far more serious crimes, there's a real problem there.
And of course, potentially other forces. Quick thought on this, Camilla, a very important story in the eye. Women face postcode lottery for HRT supply. The headline: patients living in poor areas are less likely to be prescribed hormone replacement therapy amid widespread shortages.
Yes, so we've had quite a few stories coming out over recent months about HRT shortages across the country, about GPs being unable to get hold of it or unable to prescribe it. But what's really interesting about this story in the eye is really just showing the difference between parts of the country that are more deprived and the inaccessibility of HRT in those areas compared to wealthier areas nearby. So it's saying that wealthy areas spend 3 times more on menopause treatments than GPs do in deprived areas. So really showing that depending on which part of the country you live in, you're more likely or less likely to be able to get hold of these drugs. So quite an important revelation there on an issue that's already we know is problematic across the country, but with this wealth divide as well as other geographical divides.
Yeah. And interesting thought here in the paper: middle-class women are better informed about symptoms and benefits of HRT, and it's the GPs who need better education, say experts. Listen, we'll discuss that more in the next hour, but we'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you both very much indeed.